Good evening and welcome back to the Hidebound Convivium for Monday, September 9th, 2019, and the Muh Bible Podcast. So before anyone starts screaming at me or throwing rocks at me or whatever it may be, I do owe everyone an explanation of my behavior for the past week because, as you may have noticed, I did not release any videos whatsoever last week. Now, I knew I wasn't going to put out a Muh Bible Podcast episode for last Monday, but the rest of the week sort of got away from me and I didn't put out anything. Part of the reason for that was some issues that came up with my teaching placement that I had to get sorted out. Some other reasons for that was because so I work for a newspaper for the school, and typically every other Wednesday is a layout night where we stay up pretty late and lay out the pages for the print edition of the newspaper. So that kept me up Wednesday. I was working pretty much from 2 o'clock in the afternoon until 2 o'clock the following morning. So very tiring, and I just did not have time to put out a video Wednesday. And then Friday, I really could have put out a video, but I was just so exhausted from the rest of the week that I dropped the ball, and that's really my own fault. But given all these obligations that I have to my job, to my school, and to various other things that I have going on in my life, I've decided that it is in fact time to change up my schedule a little bit. 3 videos a week was probably pushing it. So the new schedule for this channel should be flashing up on your screen here. And what it's basically going to boil down to is that instead of doing 3 videos a week, it's going to be Monday's Muh Bible Podcast every week, as always. Friday, there's going to be a video every week, but it's going to flip back and forth. So, one week it's going to be featured content, so sort of like when I read The Seafarer, or it's going to be something of that nature. And then the off week will be original content, will be an essay or something that I've written. I would say also part of the reason why I've been so busy is that I now have official duties for the Canis Society, so I've been trying to work on things that the Canis Education Committee can do, and more or less this channel may end up becoming sort of an auxiliary or a wing of that effort, even as it's also my own personal thing. And given also that I realized I don't have a mechanism for contacting people who might be interested in developments in this channel, I'm linking my Twitter account below. I don't really use my Twitter all that much other than just to browse through it. And I'm thinking of doing what the Distributus has recently done, which is just to get a Telegram account, and then just link that through to Twitter so I don't have to deal with it. But either way, you're going to see the Twitter link is going to be down in the description, and then there's going to be the schedule up there, and you can just take stock of that and reference that for a second. And so, as I promised you guys last week, this is going to be a talky episode. More or less, we're going to go through things like explaining Abraham's behavior in this passage in chapter 16 with Ishmael. We're going to be explaining the Covenant of Circumcision, which a lot of people are confused by, myself included. And then we will cover, I think, briefly events occurring in chapter 18. Chapter 19 mostly kind of explains itself, so it's not something I'm really going to focus on for this video. And we're going to have commentary here from Didymus the Blind, Ambrose of Milan, and Augustine. So starting off, we're in chapter 16. And as you may remember, in chapter 16, I'm just going to give you a brief recap. Sarah, or Sarai at the time, I suppose, she realizes that she is barren and God has promised Abraham a son, so she takes it upon herself to give Hagar, her maidservant, over to Abraham as a concubine. Abraham takes her and she bears him a son named Ishmael. and Sarah is extremely jealous of this and basically abuses Hagar. Hagar flees out into the woods and is or into the wilderness rather, and is confronted by an angel who tells her that her son Ishmael will be blessed, and that she should go back and submit herself again to her master Sarai. Um, and Ishmael, in fact, it is promised that he will have a very illustrious line of chieftains, warriors, and we touched on this a little bit in the last episode. But Didymus the Blind, writing in the 4th century, towards the end of the 4th century, he gives a little bit of a account of Abraham's behavior because it can be somewhat confusing for us as moderns, as Christians, to understand this whole arrangement, especially the concubinage that occurs by which Ishmael is born. And so Didymus here recalls that the apostle, and he's talking of Paul, saw in these women the type of the two covenants in accordance with the rules of allegory. So we've already touched on this. I believe it was in the letter to the Corinthians. Paul talks about Ishmael and Isaac in an allegorical sense. But since what the text narrates actually took place, Didymus says, the literal sense also deserves consideration. The saints entered the married life not to pursue pleasure, but for the sake of children. This is in fact a tradition that says that they would go with their wives only when the time was suitable for conception. They would not go with them during the lactation period, when they were nursing their young, or when they were with child, because they regarded neither of these times as suitable for coming together. When Sarah, therefore, who was wise and holy, had observed for a long time that in spite of coming together with her husband she was not conceiving, she abstained from conjugal relations, and since she knew that it was in the order of things that he should have children, she gave him her slave girl as a concubine. This shows moderation, sophrosyne, and the absence of jealousy of Sarah and passionlessness, apatheia, of Abraham, who chose this solution at his wife's instigation and not of his own initiative, who yielded to her request only in order to give birth to children. The literal sense, too, then, is useful according to considerations offered above. So basically, Didymus is making a point here saying Abraham, who is a saint, he's not doing this out of consideration for his own pleasure, essentially. This is all for the plan. He's trying to bring about the prophecy that God has given him that he will have a son by whom by whom he will be blessed and he'll found a nation. It's just the fact that Sarah, I guess, is wanting to skip a step here and just say, hey, here's my maidservant, have the son with her, because obviously I'm not going to be the one that's going to do it. And it's interesting because it's not actually until later that God appears and tells him that Sarai will bear him a son. So in this instance, they're working off limited information. So, Didymus at least is willing to excuse Abraham this indiscretion. And then on the topic of, Isaac and Ishmael and their type, especially as Paul. It's actually in the Galatians because I'm reading this right now, and the Paul gives this allegory in the letter to the Galatians. So he's reading this passage in light of what Paul says in Galatians. So virtue's purpose was, as we have said, this is still Didymus, that the wise man do training exercises, first in preliminary education and shadows, so that later, with his training behind him, he might arrive at greater things, which is the proper procedural order. It is likewise illogical that after the knowledge of perfect things, one should turn back to petty things. This is in fact what the Apostle Paul writes to the Galatians, who, after the gospel had been preached to them, wanted to live with the shadow, which is the law. They had been taken in by a certain Ebion, who wanted to practice Judaism after having become a Christian, and who was so successful in persuading others that the apostles gave him this surname to show his poverty. Ebion, in fact, means poor, and he was so called because of the perversion and poverty of his ideas. So, what he's calling attention to here is that whereas Abraham did this thing having a son by his servant, because he was shrouded in ignorance, essentially. He contrasts this with how Paul, talking about the Galatians, they've already received the perfect law, which is the law of the Christian religion, and now they're wanting to go back. So in essence, they're sort of an anti-Abraham. They've started with perfect information, and now they're going back to a less perfect state. So this would be as if Abraham was promised a son by Sarai, which he was not promised at this time, and then went back and had the son with Hagar anyway. And so he says of Abraham, for example, and this whole thing with concubinage. For we must understand why the invisible circumcision was given, and until what time it was appropriate to practice it. If one understood this, he has had children from the concubine, and is able, after this, to comprehend the circumcision of the heart that is effected by the Spirit. The holy man, so Abraham, upon the advice of virtue, went into the slave girl whom she had placed at his disposal, as we have explained, and the slave girl conceived. But after this, it is inappropriate to remain with her beyond the time of her favor. Many, indeed, having made use of the preparatory exercises in view of the perfect teaching, never go beyond this point, thus giving birth to a progeny of slavery, and in a certain sense dishonor virtue. One dishonors virtue, then, who gives other things precedence over it. For if one chooses virtue not for its own sake, but for the sake of something else, praise, for example, or glory, then in a certain sense one is dishonoring the good, which in itself is not susceptible to dishonor. All of this is to say, in a roundabout way, that Abraham, working off of imperfect information, makes what is essentially a mistake, but he does it for virtue's sake. So he can't really be held to blame in this regard, I suppose. But moving on, we're going to go to chapter 17, because there's going to be more to talk about Ishmael and Isaac later on in the narrative. So in chapter 17, as you may recall, the Covenant of Circumcision is implemented, wherein Abraham, all the members of his household, and all of their servants, slaves, are required to circumcise the foreskin. All the males, I should say. And so circumcision, we need to understand, and this is what the fathers are basically going to say, is that we need to understand circumcision as a type of baptism. And just as circumcision is highly physical, it's crude, baptism is a perfection of circumcision, because it is both physical and it has a real spiritual dimension. Not that circumcision doesn't have a real spiritual dimension, just that in baptism, both the physical and spiritual dimension are more perfected. And of course, baptism is extended to Gentiles as well as to the progeny of Abraham. So Ambrose of Milan, speaking on the covenant of circumcision, says, I know that this part of the text is disturbing to many. Indeed, if circumcision is a good thing, it should be maintained today as well. If it is useless, it should never have been mandated in the first place, particularly not by divine precept. But inasmuch as the apostles said, Abraham received the sign of circumcision, certainly the sign is not the reality itself, but points to another reality. That is, it is not the truth, but points to the truth. In fact, Paul expounds this teaching in the following terms. He received the sign of circumcision as a seal of justice and of faith. For this reason, it is not inappropriate for us to understand that bodily circumcision is a sign of spiritual circumcision. Therefore, the sign remained until the truth arrived. The Lord Jesus arrived, he who says, I am the way, the truth, and the life, because he circumcises the whole person in truth, not a minor bodily member in sign. He abolished the sign. He installed the truth, because once that which was perfected arrived, that which was partial was abolished. Thus the circumcision of a part ceased when the circumcision of the whole shone forth. For it is now no longer man in part, but the whole man, who is saved in body, saved in soul. For it is written, If any man would come after me, let him deny himself, take up his cross, and follow me. This is the perfect circumcision, because through the sacrifice of the body the soul is redeemed, of which the Lord himself says, Whoever loses his life for my sake, he will save it. And so George Leo Haydock, who is a later commentator writing in the 19th century, says, "You shall, either by yourself or by the ministry of others, with respect to infants, the part of the body was chosen." So he's speaking more in the physical aspects of circumcision. He says that part of the body was chosen because the effects of sin first appeared there, and because a part of the Hebrews' creed was that Christ should be born of the family of Abraham, a sign that Abraham had agreed to the covenant with God and to be a memorial of his faith and justice. He cites Romans chapter 4, verse 2. To distinguish also the faithful from infidels, to purge away original sin in male children 8 days old, and to be a figure of baptism. Menocius, Tyrannus, uh, he's citing Menocius and Tyrannus. God always appoints some sign of his covenants, as Jesus Christ instituted the holy sacrament of his body and blood under exterior appearances to assure us of his new alliance with Christians. The sacraments of the old law caused grace only by means of faith in the Redeemer, of which there were signs. In this sense, the Holy Fathers assert that circumcision remitted original sin to those who could receive it, though some think it was only a bare sign or distinctive mark of the Jews. It is far beneath our baptism, which is more easy, general, and efficacious, as the Christian sacraments are not like those of Moses, weak and needy elements. And so this is, like I said, both of these commentators are drawing out what I've already stated, was that circumcision is a prototype of baptism. Just so if it's a prototype, baptism is the type. It fulfills this role that circumcision seems to play, which is on a mechanical sense to relieve people from original sin, but also to serve as a sign of one's entering into a covenant with God. So baptism, as Haydock points out, is more easy, general, and efficacious. For one thing, baptism can be undergone both by men and by women, because in the Jewish ritual, women were not circumcised, although there are certain religious sects that do practice female circumcision. Um, and circumcision obviously is painful for adults, naturally. Of course, children wouldn't remember it, even though it's still painful for them. And also, there is sort of this idea floating around. People have said, for example, that Old Testament precepts against, defecating near a settlement were God's way of keeping the Jewish people healthier. And so it is possible that the institution of circumcision sort of cut down on infections per se. At least this is one of the reasons why doctors nowadays still prescribe circumcision, even though it's less effective for that reason. And so one could at least say it might have that sort of general application with a material gain in mind. But moreover, we just want to focus on this prototype type relationship between circumcision and baptism, because I think that's the key to understanding the covenant of circumcision. And then of course there's other things to get into, like why the foreskin of the penis. Obviously it has to do with a sort of cutting off of sexual desire, or a maintaining of control over the male member, right? Which is important. Symbolically, it's important. Um, and all of this brings to mind one big question, which is, why does God institute one covenant and then come, thousands of years later and institute a second one that's completely different? Well, on the one hand, it's not completely different. As I've stated, you have a weak circumcision is sort of a weak and impoverished understanding of baptism, and then baptism is a fulfillment of this weak and impoverished understanding of the circumcision of the heart. So, in the same way, it's not so much that the Old Testament laws are abrogated, so much as they are made to be perfect in the Christian religious practice. But more than that, one could say, well, why all this changing over the course of centuries? Well, there is the simple adage that even though God may not live within, may not operate within time, human beings certainly do. And So if you take another thing, for example, in the Old Testament and in the New Testament, prophecies are seen as a way to sort of fact check God. Prophecies, for example, in the book of Daniel are given that prefigure the Christ. And so you're supposed to be able to check against this prophecy to see that God is real and he's doing what he said he was going to do. But prophecies, by their necessity, require them to be strung out over a long period of time. Otherwise, it's not a very good prophecy. So, in the same way, these laws are allowed to be instituted for a time, develop, and then be fulfilled in Christ, so as to be evidence of the working of God's providence in the world. And I think that and everything else I've said previously is the best way to understand the covenant of circumcision and its prefigurement of baptism. So then we'll move on to chapter 18 and we'll be done for the day. And on chapter 18, there's one specific question, and this is about the angels. So remember at the beginning of chapter 18, um, Abraham is parked with his tent and his family at the Oak of Mamre, and three figures come up to him and he greets them as God essentially and brings them an offering, and they eat with him and they tell him that the city of Sodom is going to be destroyed, and this is where he pleads essentially for Lot, although he does it in a roundabout way. And so Ambrose sees these angels, these visitors, as a type of the Trinity, perhaps the Trinity itself or angels that represent the Trinity. So he says, Abraham, who is glad to receive strangers, faithful to God and tireless in his service and prompt in fulfilling his duty, saw the Trinity typified. He added religious devotion to hospitality. For although he beheld three, he adored one. And while keeping a distinction of the persons, yet he called one Lord, thus giving honor to the three, but signifying one power. For not knowledge, but grace spoke in him. And he believed better what he was not learned, that we and he believed better what he had not learned than we who have been taught. No one had falsified the type of truth, and therefore he saw three, but worshipped their unity. He brought out 3 measures of meal, but slaughtered 1 calf, believing in 1 sacrifice was sufficient, but a threefold offering, 1 victim, but a threefold gift. So it's actually sort of unclear here whether Ambrose is saying the angels are the Trinity or are a type of the Trinity. Either way, you can read this. Augustine, on the other hand, he very vigorously asserts that these are just angels, because I think Augustine is more concerned with these sort of concrete problems. And so he gives an account of it like this. God appeared again to Abraham at the oak of Mamre in 3 men, who it is not to be doubted were angels, although some think that one of them was Christ, and assert that he was visible before he put on flesh. Now it belongs to divine power, an invisible, incorporeal, and incommunicable nature, without changing itself at all, to appear even to mortals, not by what it is, but by what is subject to it. And what is not subject to it? Yet if they try to establish that one of these 3 was Christ by the fact that although he saw 3, he addressed the Lord in the singular, as it is written, he lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, 3 men stood in front of him. When he saw them, he ran from the tent door to meet them, and bowed himself to the earth, and said, My Lord, if I have found favor in your sight, why do they not refer also to this, that when 2 of them came to destroy the Sodomites, while Abraham still spoke to the one, calling him Lord, and interceding that he would not destroy the righteous along with the wicked in Sodom, Lot received these 2 in such a way that he too, in his conversation with them, addressed the Lord in the singular? For after saying to them in the plural, My lords, turn aside, I pray, to your servant's house, yet it is afterwards said, So the angel seized him in his hand, because the Lord was merciful to him, and they brought him forth and set him out of the city. And when they had brought him forth, they said, Flee for your life, and do not look back, so on and so forth. And Lot said to them, O no, my lords, behold, your servant has found favor in your sight. And then after these words, the Lord also answered him in the singular, although he was in 2 angels, saying, Behold, I grant you this favor. This makes it more credible that Abraham and the three men and Lot and the two recognized the Lord, addressing him in the singular number, even when they were addressing men, for they received them as they did for no other reason than that they might minister human nourishment to them as men who needed it. Yet there was about them something so excellent that those who showed them hospitality as men could not doubt that God was in them, and he was wont to be in the prophets, and therefore sometimes addressed them in the plural, and sometimes God in them in the singular. But that they were angels, the Scripture testifies, not only in the book of Genesis, in which these transactions are related, but also in the epistles of the Hebrews, where in praising hospitality it is said, "For thereby some have entertained angels unawares." So essentially, uh, Augustine declares that when Abraham is talking of the angels as Lord, he's essentially talking to the Lord through the angels. That the angels, as messengers, seek to convey a sense of God, but are not God in and of themselves, which can be sort of confusing. But I think this makes sense. Although we will get to other passages in the Old Testament that are generally seen by Christian scholars to be Christological passages where the angel of the Lord as a character is brought to the fore. One of these, for example, is the episode with the burning bush in Exodus. And so we'll get to that down the road. But for right now, we're just talking about merely angels in the narrative of Sodom and Gomorrah. And so I would be remiss if I didn't say a little bit more about chapter 19, the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. The thing is, this text doesn't really bother people so much because they understand, Sodom and Gomorrah, their cities full of wicked people. They try to rape the angels that come to Lot. And so people, naturally are like, yeah, Sodom and Gomorrah, terrible place. Let's blow it up. But they get a little bit less gung-ho when we talk about these other Canaanite peoples that are put to the sword, for example, in the book of Judges and things of this nature. And we'll get to those so-called dark passages in later episodes. But for this episode, that's closing remarks on the bit about the angels in chapter 18. Augustine seems to think that they are merely angels. Ambrose, either that they're angels that embody the different members of the Trinity, or that they are the Trinity themselves. His wording here is not extremely clear. But anyway, guys, that is Muh Bible Podcast for September 9th of 2019. Thanks for tuning in, and like I said, I'm very sorry about last week and the utter lack of any real content. This week, hopefully, I'm going to get back on the horse, and I'm looking forward to doing more stuff for the Canis Society as a temporary chair of the Education Committee. But either way, God bless, and you guys have a great day.